My name is Jessica Quick. I'm the lead for the Peel Newcomer Strategy Group. We're a project of the United Way of Greater Toronto and based in Peel Region. So we'd like to acknowledge that our land in which we work is the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. In particular, we acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabeg, Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe Chippewa peoples, the land that is home to the Métis and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And just want to also mention that as part of our commitment, we're starting to look at how we can deepen our involvement with the Indigenous community. And one opportunity I know is with the Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture. And they have a new collective that's starting around truth and reconciliation, and how the immigrant and refugee serving sector can start to prepare in terms of that commitment. I'm going to introduce my colleague Shreya, who's also here, and she'll be sharing some links in the chat box at the end of the session around evaluation. So really hoping that you can take the moment to let us know what you thought of the session. And without further ado, I'm really welcoming everyone to this session about digital outreach to raise awareness for newcomers and help them become more aware of settlement services. And I know we've all shifted to hybrid delivery. And so this webinar will help you have a greater knowledge about how information is shared with newcomers and how newcomers access information using technology, and how we can transfer some of what we do around community engagement into the digital sphere. And so our facilitator today is Marco Campana. Many of you may have seen him in previous sessions, and we're really happy to have him again. He brings over almost 30 years of work in communications, digital services, and settlement. He was the first settlement.org content coordinator. He created and managed the Settlement at Work site, launched Okazi's Learn at Work online learning site, and participated in a number of efforts to create a sector community of practice. He has also worked at the Maitrey Foundation on their digital and social media strategy, and currently works as a freelance consultant helping agencies harness technology and client service delivery with a focus on digital transformation. So it's a real delight to introduce Marco, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to share my screen and we'll dive in. So yeah, as Jessica said, the first thing is feel free to at any point, if there's a question you want to bring up, she's going to monitor the chat, so you can type it into the chat, or you can hit the reactions and raise a hand, and I'll try to notice. It's harder when my screen is fully shared, but if there's a question as I'm talking, please feel free to jump in. So we're here to talk about innovative outreach strategies to reach newcomers. And before I start, I also want to do my own land acknowledgement. Thank you, Jessica, for leading into that. So I'm in East York, which is the traditional territory of a number of different nations, but particularly the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we're under the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which is actually quite interesting if you look it up. It's considered one of the first sort of very democratic agreements between nations from many years ago. So I'm responsible for, as I live and work and raise a family here, to honor that treaty and honor the First Nations who came before us with peace, friendship, and respect. And as Jessica mentioned, I also wonder what responsibilities we have as a sector when it comes to truth and reconciliation. And I think that we can go a little bit deeper. So I'm really just going to quickly share a couple of things that I've been working on, because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada only has 2 specific calls of action related to newcomers. So I've got an article, and again, all the links will be in the PDF that I share that gets sent out after. But the 2 calls are really specific. One is to add some language about treaties and First Nations to the Oath of Citizenship, and that's actually been done. Pretty simple. The next is to add more information to the Welcome to Canada guide, right? That guide that newcomers are meant to get access to when they come to Canada to help inform them. And that's still very much a work in progress. They've been consulting. The federal government's been consulting with Indigenous groups and with newcomer groups. But there's a lot that's been done in our sector. And so in this article, there's a number of groups around fostering safe spaces for dialogue. A lot of groups in Manitoba in particular have created and worked with Indigenous peoples to sort of figure out how can we work together so newcomers understand their place, right? They're not original settlers, but we're all, settler colonists as we move into a new country. And what are the implications? What should the dialogue look like? Where are there pieces where newcomers and Indigenous folks are aligned? And what do we mean when we hear in land acknowledgements things like unceded territory? We hear that in other parts of the country, for example, and things like that. So there's also some really interesting resources that I've added below that are sector specific, that are useful, that you can even use in your ESL and your linked classrooms and beyond. So just wanted to kind of share a little bit about that, to give a sense of, we can move beyond sort of the performative land acknowledgements. And as Jessica mentioned, let's figure out what we can do as a sector. And there's some really good things that are happening already, and it sounds like emerging as well. So today we are here to focus on outreach, and the approach, as mentioned in the Eventbrite registration, that I like to use is something called, other people have called the P.O.S.T method, where you think about people, your objectives, your strategy, and then your tactics. Now, this is an approach that's more than 15 years old. People used it for social media for a long time. And what it does is it really centers people. It centers the people you're trying to reach, the people you're trying to get to do something with, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to spend a lot of time today making sure that we have approaches and understandings about the newcomers and the communities that you're trying to serve. So this is going to be very interactive. I mentioned to Jessica and Shreya earlier, I'm trying a new tool today. It may or may not work, so we'll have some plan Bs in the background. But my goal is for you to share what you're hearing, what you're learning, what you're doing, so we can kind of learn together, but also to walk you through some steps that you can use within your own organization, right? So this P.O.S.T method is something that we should all be doing when it comes to broader communications, when it comes to social media, when it comes to any kind of outreach, as a strategy for doing this effectively. So we'll start with people. We'll look at how do you define your objectives, what you're trying to do and why. Talk a little bit about what a strategic approach to all of this looks like, and then we'll focus on tactics. And a lot of people are surprised because tactics is usually what we jump to, right? We jump to technology. We jump to, oh, should I be on Twitter? Should I be digital messaging? Should I be on Facebook and things like that? And what you'll see with the P.O.S.T method, and one of the reasons why I find it really useful, is if you follow through this process, this flow, the tactics reveal themselves. They become obvious to you because you understand the people you're trying to serve fully. And so the messaging becomes clear because you understand what they need to hear, how they want to hear it, who they trust, things like that. So I'm just going to give you some initial thoughts, and then we're going to dive into a little bit of an icebreaker. And one is, I find when I have these conversations about technology in particular, is to remind people, don't forget everything you already know how to do, right? Sorry about that. I'll go back. We spend a lot of time thinking about what is possible without realizing we know a lot, right? There's a lot of wisdom in this room, and that's why I want to go through these exercises with you, because you know a lot about your own resources, your own services, as well as the newcomers you're serving. We also want to talk a lot about adapting to to newcomers' technology use, right? So the question isn't, should I be on Twitter? Should I be on Facebook? Is, where are my clients? Where are the people I'm trying to reach gathering online, and how can I reach them? And how do you tailor what you're trying to communicate to the people you're trying to reach, right? And so there are many different kinds of groups that you might be reaching, or segments or audiences, right? And they include people who have never heard about you, to the clients that you're working with who know you deeply and you want to help them with more information. So how do you figure out who needs to hear what kinds of messages, and how do you tailor that to them? And then how do you find the channels to reach those different groups, right? And part of reaching those groups is the idea of networks and influencers. Influencers is just another word for community organizers or gatekeepers, right? If I asked you in your community, who would you go to if you wanted to do a presentation or put up some posters or share some flyers, right? Everyone would be able to come off the top of their head. Oh, I'd go to the local faith community, the grocery store, because everyone goes there. There's some community centers. There's this informal seniors group that meets on Wednesdays, and I would definitely talk to them. So the question is, who are those people online, and figuring out, because they tend to be different than the in-person gatekeepers. So figuring out how you can embrace them and bring them into reaching out to people. And focusing again, when we're talking about online outreach, is we need to be mobile. Everything we do has to be mobile friendly, right? And I'll show you some statistics, but we already know this anecdotally that newcomers tend to be using mobile and smartphones first. And in the end with all of this is, let's not forget the in-person and traditional approaches for outreach, right? Not everybody wants to be reached online. Not everyone is online. So how do you combine the way you're reaching out in order to reach people both in person, in physical spaces, as well as online? And so it's not just about technology, right? So I'm going to say this a lot, right? I'm going to hammer it home, but we're going to need to understand and listen to our clients and communities. We need to understand how they access information, how they find information, who they trust. We need to understand that technology is more than social media as well. So a lot of the conversation tends to sort of focus around or revolve around this idea of which social media tool should I be using? And we need to understand being strategic means there are different choices that are out there and we have to use them differently. And then always, although outreach is not as big, privacy, security, and confidentiality are not as big an issue in outreach as they are in client service when you're using technology or in general, because you're trying to reach out to people. They're not necessarily going to be sharing personal information with you, but they might, right? Because a lot of people in these spaces use them in different ways. So how do you ensure that if you're reaching out on Facebook and someone starts to share some personal information, that you've built in some strategic processes so that you know what to do with that moment, with that message, with that person to move them into a more secure space, for example. So as Jessica mentioned, we're all moving towards or have moved into a hybrid service delivery model. So technology has always been part of our service work and culture, but even more so, right? We're using it to serve, to share information. We're using it to inform and refer people. We're using it to transfer knowledge across organizations, to manage projects, to manage our clients, to collaborate, and then today to market and outreach our materials, right? So if we're being strategic, we need to make sure we understand who we're serving and where they are. We need to understand their habits, both digital as well as information practices, their communications preferences, their language preferences, right? What are they looking for when they come to your channels? Are they looking to be entertained? Are they looking to be informed? Are they looking for a call to action? Why are they even visiting your website or your social media? How are you reaching them? What drives them to action? And then what are your goals in these spaces, right? It's easy to create a Twitter account or, download and install the WhatsApp app or Telegram, for example.
You know what, why don't we?
But what are your goals
why
and
don't we
outcomes
switch these?
in those spaces, for example? And that takes a little bit more time, right? The technology is increasingly not the challenge anymore. It's our strategy behind it. So how do we get there? And we're going to talk a lot about that today. So today we're going to talk about what you know about newcomer information practice. So in a moment, I'm going to put a link into the chat that will hopefully work. And what you'll see is this screen. And on the screen, you can ignore the right-hand side where it says use an existing account, and you're going to use a guest account today. You can put your name or any name. You can be as anonymous as you want. You don't need to upload a picture. You can choose from the avatars if you want, or you can just put in a name. So I'm going to use Marco Test. And I'm going to say, okay, I'm ready. And what you should hopefully come to is this page. So I'm going to put that in the chat right now. And all you should need to do is click on it. You can access this on a phone. It's mobile friendly. You can access this in every browser except the very old Internet Explorer. So it should work on Edge if that's what you're using. And I'll give you all a moment just to get in there. And then we'll start. Once you're in, and I'm going to keep the participant view open. So I'm going to go through this with you. So on the left, we're going to start with this. So as soon as you come in, if you can click on what you know about newcomer information practice, and I will start publishing. So you should start to see what I'm seeing on my screen. And so when we're talking about newcomer information practice, right, when we're talking about knowing your audience, this is the big piece is, we want to know who are the people we're trying to reach, what matters most to them. How can you reach them? What's the most effective messaging you can give them? And what's stopping you from reaching them now? So I'm going to ask you a few questions. So what should be popping up on your screen now are some very, very quick yes/no questions. And so all you have to do, so the first one I want to know is, have you asked your clients about how they find, use, and act on information? So just choose yes or no, and then click on Save Answer. I'll give you a moment to do that. Is anyone having any issues accessing this just before I move on? or is everybody finding and getting into this okay? Because it doesn't tell me numbers, unfortunately, of people who are in there. Okay, so I'm going to assume you're in. So I'll give you a moment to play with that. So have you asked your clients about how they find, use, and act on information? So 77% of you so far say yes, and 22% say no. So that's really interesting. And that's really important. So you're starting to get this information. You're starting to ask your clients about this, and that's essential to understand them. So the next question is, do you ask your clients about their communication preferences, right? So by that, I mean, is how they prefer to be communicated with. So for example, do they prefer getting an email or a phone call or a text or a WhatsApp message? So do you do it formally in your intake or needs assessment? Do you do it informally as you're getting to know them, as you're working with them? Or you're not really asking that question at this point in time? So again, choose one of them and then click Save Answer. I'll give you a moment to play with that. Okay, so let's see where we're at. So 55% of you are doing it formally, 34% are doing it informally, and about 10% are not asking those questions. So that's great. It's really useful to know what that you're asking them at the point of intake about their communication preferences, because this is a big piece about how we start to understand newcomers and their preferences. And so just some free form. Now I'm curious about how you're using, just to give me a sense of how you're using social media, your digital channels, or your website to engage newcomers. How are you reaching out to them using these different tools? So again, if you can type in some words, a phrase, a paragraph, and a number of bullet points, and then just click Save Answer. Yeah, I'll give you another few seconds. Okay, thank you for folks in the chat telling me that you got an okay. Appreciate that. Okay, let's see. Oh, whoops, sorry. How folks are answering. Posting flyers, using MailChimp. So for folks who don't know, MailChimp is an email newsletter service. So an email newsletter through paid ads, paid job boards, event websites, posting on LinkedIn, flyers, word of mouth. Word of mouth is very important. Facebook advertisements, other kinds of advertisements, marketing on Instagram, sharing client stories, flyers, a lot of Facebook posts, posting webinars, new services. Okay, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We start to see the usual trio of social media. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram are always coming up. So Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, ads as well. Okay, so that'll be really interesting to hear as we're moving into tactics, how people have found ads to be useful. So a lot more people using paid ads than probably if we started asking this question a year ago. Paid ads might not have even come up very often, but increasingly, just because of the way social media has worked, you need to cut through the clutter by actually spending a little bit of money on ads. So educational posts, absolutely, really interesting. So the content is related to what clients are interested in. The calendar, social media, newsletters, services are online only, so advertising on social media, observing trends, giving information. Great. So lots and lots of different approaches. And this is what we'll see as we're going through today. There's a huge diversity in what people are doing. So I'm curious now, what's working for you and what's not working? Where are you finding some challenges, whether it's in the use of the technology or finding people, or maybe you're posting, but you're not getting engagement. Maybe you've been doing this for a while, but you haven't seen your group of followers grow or be engaged with what you're doing. What are some of the things that are working, and what are some of the things that you're still finding challenging? You can see people typing away on their camera, so I'll give you another minute. Okay, let's see what we've got so far. Sorry if you're in the middle of typing. Getting newcomer youth to respond to emails. Oh yes, newcomer youth always comes up as a challenge when we talk about outreach and when we talk about technology. Not getting engagement, not finding people. I'm hoping that that's what's working, is that you're reaching as many as people as possible, but that tends to be not what's working. So Eventbrite is working as a place for signups. If you're not using Eventbrite for event registration, I definitely strongly recommend it. It does a lot of the work for you in the background and can be really useful for follow-up as well. Random forwards are not working, right? So not being targeted for sure. Facebook ads do seem to be effective, great. Language access, understanding the pre-arrival audience, client access to internet and technology. Yeah, and that's why today we want to talk about how outreach is not just online, right? Because we know there is a digital divide and there are digital inclusion challenges. So that's important. Strong registration, less people actually attending. That is always been a challenge, I would suggest. In our sector, I would say it's been probably even stronger when it comes to online, because it's easy to sign up for things, right? And it's easy to forget. And that's why tools like Eventbrite can be really useful, because they prompt someone to add it to their calendar, or if they're using a Google account, sometimes it even automatically adds it for them. And doing follow-ups leading up to events is really important. And once again, Eventbrite allows you to do that. So you can schedule emails. I think actually Eventbrite has by default 2 days before, the day before, and 2 hours before. But you can actually go in and change those messages and change even the schedule of when emails are sent, so that people are reminded they have a session coming up. And that can be really, really useful, because that happens not just amongst newcomers, but in general, I would say. And like even today, some people sign up because they just want to watch the recording after. And so that's, we'll talk about that as the strategy is people not attending live a negative if they can get access to the information after? And the answer is it depends, right? It depends on what you're trying to do with them and what you define as a measure of success. So finding people, best in-person outreach options and locations, absolutely. So still struggling with figuring out, where do I reach people? Where do they gather? Very little engagement, not much engagement through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter posts. Word of mouth works mostly. And that's something that even with the online, and why I talked earlier about the influencers, is something we want to always keep in mind. When you look at, if anyone's doing a deep dive into their statistics with Facebook, Instagram, Twitter posts, and things like that, you tend to see maybe 1 to 3% of engagement, right? Which means a number of things. It means someone saw it, someone interacted with it, maybe they liked it, or they reposted it, or they reshared it, or they commented on it. But it's a very, very low percentage compared to and so the impact, you might be raising a bit of awareness, but are you driving them through your calls to action? And that's why we want to make sure that we understand what we define as a measure for success in these different tools, and how many resources we allocate to using them. So you're not going to necessarily stop being on social media, but you can start to understand how much effort you should be putting into that versus the word of mouth, which means empowering people to share information about you, giving them useful ways to share information, reaching out to those online influencers and those gatekeepers and those Telegram and WhatsApp and WeChat group administrators to help you get the word out about that. So the final thing, I just want to make sure that I'm in the ballpark here. So are there any burning questions that you want to make sure we cover today? We have a very broad agenda. And I have some very specific things that I want to make sure you leave with, but I want to make sure that also we either are able to address your questions during the session, or I can identify them as things that I can flag to follow up with and share with Jessica and Shreya after, if I'm not addressing it directly today. So tell me a little bit about what you came to learn today, and what you most would feel this would be a success for you. Give you all another few seconds. Thank you to everyone that's sharing, by the way. It's really useful to see what's working for you, what your experience is. It's great to see how many of you are asking your clients about communication preferences, because I think that's really important. And it's changed a lot over the last few years. We didn't used to do as much of that. And it's really good to see that many of you are doing that today. All right, let's take a look at the results. Sorry if I'm cutting you off midstream. which strategies have worked best for you based on reaching newcomers, most effective way for outreach, how to attract people, strategies, best way to obtain email address and client information. Oh, interesting. Best marketing strategies, techniques to do effective, fresh approach. Yeah, this is great. Okay, this is good, Jessica. This is what we're focused on. So people are here asking the questions that we're going to be focused on today. So this is excellent. Does Instagram ad work? Ads, do they work for youth? Good question. So a lot of what you're going to hear, and I'm going to be repetitive throughout, so I'm going to start answering that question now. The question is, for things like this, is you need to ask them, right? There's no, this is what, when we talk about people as part of the post, is most of what will determine how you answer this question is by talking to the people that you're trying to serve, right? So talking, if you're working with youth, convene a group with them, or ask them one-on-one informally as you're serving them. Hey, we're thinking of using Instagram more. Do you click on Instagram ads? Do you find them effective? Do you just scroll past them? What would catch your attention? And while you're having that conversation, you can ask them other questions just about, are you following us on Instagram? And if you are, why? What are you hoping to get there? What would make it useful for you? How can we share something that would be good for you? So a lot of what we understand of newcomers comes down to asking them, talking to the people that you're actually already serving, to learn from them. And that will inevitably help you learn to serve other people who you might not already be serving. So finding clients and getting them to reach out. Yeah. Ways to engage people who do not have access to technology. And that's, again, the in-person, the not technological outreach stuff. Transition from online to in-person outreach post the pandemic. It's a good question. And I think that you want to kind of look at where that line is, right? Because it might be quite different than it was in the past. You might be doing less in-person, or you might be doing more, right? Making that transition, again, will depend on what you understand of the people you're trying to reach. Do they want to see more of you in the community, or are they comfortable with getting that information online through the different places where you're reaching out to them? Strategies to attract. Yep. How to engage clients so they value in services. Great. What outreach strategies are most proven? How to leverage social media to reach out. Does outreach still work in person? And the short answer is yes, but always a but it depends on who you're serving and what you understand of them, right? And so that's something that's really important. So this is great. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to ask you to, on the top left corner, so that's all the questions I have for you for this portion. This is super useful for us to move on. I'm going to reshare my slides, but for now, you can just click on the top left little house to go back to this. We're going to come to this one in a little while, but for now, I just want to reshare and go through a full, actually, before I go on, any quick questions? Oh, of course, Marianne, is it possible to use GPT for our marketing, and how? Now, I haven't spent much time on this in the presentation, other than to look into this and say it's possible. And there are other people who are sharing lots of really useful information out there. So ChatGPT, for folks who haven't used it, is what's called a generative AI tool, where you can go to a website and basically have a conversation with a bot, essentially, right? And so so the short answer is yes and no, right? So ChatGPT is not going to have all of the knowledge around your clients and around the people you're serving, but what it will have is useful. You can have a useful conversation about what are some useful marketing techniques, what are some useful outreach techniques, and then you can kind of dive into it a little bit each step from there. I'm just gonna, because why not? No, I'm not going to do that now. Well, if we have time, we'll dive into it. But yes, ChatGPT can be a useful place if you don't have a big background in outreach and marketing or strategic marketing or an understanding of all these different tools. Consider it an AI assistant that has access to a tremendous volume of information. So if you go on and you want to ask it questions like, how can I make my Instagram account fresh for youth? And then you can be even more specific. How can I make it fresh for newcomer youth? You can also talk to it. The prompts in ChatGPT are really important. So one of the things that a lot of people recommend, and I found quite useful, is to tell it, you are a marketing and outreach professional who works at a social service organization serving newcomer youth. You want to use Instagram to reach those youth. What recommendations would you have? What is the right strategy? And it'll start to give you some information and ideas. you have to treat everything that ChatGPT says with a bit of a grain of salt, right? People talk about AI hallucinations, where it will just make stuff up sometimes. And so what you can do, though, is you can keep probing it. You can ask follow-up questions to your question. So if it says, oh, newcomer youth are heavy users of Instagram, it's not going to give you a lot of references. And so if you say, where are your sources for that? That's where it'll start to hallucinate, right? I've seen instances where it literally makes up entire fictional research reports, as well as links to articles that don't even exist, right? Someone was, The Guardian is a paper out of the UK, and they've discovered that ChatGPT hallucinates articles that they've allegedly written all the time. So you have to take the fact-based stuff and push it aside a little bit, but the general kinds of pieces of information can be quite useful as starting points to help you to further develop. So if you want to say, what are some good questions to ask, people in the community about their technology use or things like that, it'll pump out some really good survey questions. It'll help you to think through. So think of it as an assistant in asking some of those questions. And if there's time, we can go through some of that for sure. So it can be a bit of an assistant, but it's not always factually correct. And I personally use it as a way to think through things sometimes, because I work alone. I'm a solo freelancer, and so I'm pondering a question. So I'll search it online, but sometimes I'll go to ChatGPT as well, because it's conversational, right? Feels like you're talking to somebody. So if you haven't used it yet, if there's time, I'll show you a quick example of it. All right, so we've talked about this. So again, I want to go through really quickly just a few high-level things. I've sort of mentioned them as we were answering the questions, but knowing your audience is what's key, right? You want to start with their experience. So this is, I like to go back to where I started in the sector 30 years ago, and we focused a lot of our community development and community outreach on the popular education models, right, of Paulo Freire, who talks about start with the wisdom in the room, start with the experience and the knowledge of the people you're serving, and then identify patterns, and then add new information to it. So you want to understand your entire strategy with outreach is predicated on what you know of the people you're trying to reach. So we always want to start with that, right? Whether it's community development or doing a needs assessment, you want to start a new project, you want to do some outreach and marketing, start with what people know. Now, perhaps a more up-to-date and technical kind of view is basically a very similar approach, but with some specific steps, right? So you go through, to do online marketing, you go through a discovery process, right? Where you're asking, what are your goals? Who is the audience you're trying to reach? And what is it you're trying to offer them? And you gather data. So this is more specific. You definitely want to this is your top goal, to get information from the people you're trying to serve. But there's also a lot of information that's out there that you can access in general, right? So if you're interested in the information practices of newcomer youth, people have done a lot of research on that. If you're curious about, how seniors are using technology, there's lots of good research, academic as well as desk side research. There's blogs, there's papers, there's opinion pieces. There's, you can do interviews, you can do surveys, you can, if you're baking in those questions that we talked about earlier about your clients into the intake, into the formal parts of your assessment, you want to make sure you're using those, right, to help drive what you're doing in terms of your strategy. So you take that data and you start to analyze it, look for patterns, right? It's the same thing as going back one, where we're adding new information and we're identifying those patterns, right? So you look for them, develop some insights from them, and then test them a little bit, right? So there's a process to this where you're finding what you're learning from your clients, you're analyzing it, you're developing some insights, and then you want to test it. You want to see, is this approach actually going to work with my youth? Do Instagram ads actually work with youth? And you test it on a small scale, right? Because you don't have to spend a lot of money to test some of these things when it comes to technology and social media. And then you go back, right? You see this line at the bottom that says, go back and validate. So we learned from here that yes, our newcomer youth client are using Instagram. They're using Instagram to follow us, which is the more important question, because they might be using it, but are they using it to find information from you? And yes, if they're telling us that if we put ads up, they would click on those ads, or if we change the way we post on Instagram, they would like, they would share, they would embed those in their reels and their stories and things like that. So then you test that. You have to go through a process where you're testing what your theory is, and then going back and you'll see, okay, has this made a change? Like the tools themselves can give you some information. So Instagram will tell you these posts were more engaging. And then you can go back to your clients and find out, okay, we did it. What do you think about what we did? So you've got the quantitative data. And that's where technology is really useful, because the data will tell you these posts were more engaging, but they don't necessarily tell you who engaged with them as deeply as you might need to. So that's where you go back and you talk to your clients, you talk to the people in your community and ask them, are you the ones who clicked on those, or did we reach a whole entire different audience with those things? So constantly going through and testing and validating and testing and validating, and that will help to drive your strategic direction, because maybe the budget's coming up and you've discovered that if we spend $3 a week on Instagram ads, we reach more people and they do what we want them to do with that information, because it's not just awareness, right? And we'll talk about communications goals versus project goals and calls to action. You don't, when you're trying to do outreach, you're not just trying to necessarily raise awareness, but you want them to do something with that awareness. So yes, we got more followers on Instagram, but that's not our goal. Yes, we got more engagement on Instagram, and that's useful, but did it do what we needed it to do? Did it, when we shared those posts, did it result in more people registering for our programs? Did it result in questions coming in about that particular topic? Did it result in people attending the event we were marketing, for example, and those kinds of things as well? So this is a really useful kind of look at this in a very specific way, in almost a scientific way, right? So you're starting with everything you can gather data on. The most important will be what you know from the people you're serving, whether you interview or do some focus groups or bake that into your CRMs, for example. If you're asking those questions at intake, then you have a bit of data that you can start to play with. Look for those patterns. You need to do the analysis, right? And try to figure out, well, why is that the case? Oh, all of a sudden our clients are asking for information to be sent on Telegram. Okay, so let's test whether we create a Telegram account and what happens if we ask people to sign up for it. Is that going to happen? Or are they using Telegram in other ways? So those insights will help you kind of to drive your strategic direction. So this is a nice flow as a high level for you to sort of think through, that starts with and constantly comes back to the people you're serving, right? So this loop of gather data, analyze, test, validate, come back. You're always going back to the people that you're serving and that you're working with to try to find out, is it working for them? Right. And so when we're trying to figure out where people are at and how you can interact with them, one of the things that people talk about is kind of the journey, the newcomer journey. Where are you inserting yourself in their journey, and where are they at when it comes to being receptive of your information? So some of you are talking about pre-arrival services, right? So in pre-arrival, what are some of the barriers? What are some of their biases? Well, maybe they're not ready for information. Maybe they're already overloaded. Maybe they don't know what the right questions are. When they arrive in Canada, there's a lot that's suddenly happening, right? This is where they are at when they arrive in Canada. This is the overload, right? So in the first few weeks, I got to arrive. I got to figure out where to live. I got to start applying for my SIN card. Maybe I'm in some short-term housing. My first 6 months, I'm getting the kids in school. I'm trying to find for that housing. I'm trying to get permanent housing. I'm trying to figure out the tax system. I'm trying to figure out the banking system. I'm trying to get a job. I'm trying to take care of my my elders. There's a whole host of things that they're going through, and you're inserting yourself in this process in some way. So you've got to understand things like where they're at with their behavioral bias, where they're at with their ability to juggle the kind of information that you're finding, that you're prepared to give them, and how you're giving it to them, right? So what we want to do is we want to start building what's called an empathy map. And I don't know if people have gone through this process, but we're going to go through it today. The idea is, again, trying to fully understand. So it's kind of going back to this part about information about your client and surveys and things like that. There's data, but then there's, what do we know they're going through during all of this, right? So this is a very chaotic period for people that where you're inserting yourself into. They may be ready for it. They may not even know it exists. They may have heard different things from different people about you. So an empathy map will help you understand, what do they even think and feel about you and what you might offer? What do they see that's out there? What are they hearing about services for newcomers? What are they hearing about how to settle and integrate into the community? what are they saying and doing? What do they hear from others, right? Like we know, and I'll go through some of the stats soon, but we all know this, right? Family and friends are their primary points of information, right? Increasingly, there's also what we would call weak ties, not friends, but networks, right? People who are on these WhatsApp groups, these Facebook groups, who they have no connection with, but who are sharing their experiences about what is useful for them. So what are they hearing? And then what are they afraid of? And what are they hopeful for, right? So you can take it from, some people have made this into a trauma-informed empathy map. And so you would do this literally with every group that you're serving potentially. So who is it you're trying to serve? What is it you're trying to do with them? So it might be immigrant youth, right? So you can take a map like this and say, okay, let's sit down with our youth and let's walk through with them. What are they hearing? What are they doing about what they hear? What are they saying about our services? What are they, what are they seeing that's out there in the community other than what we're working on? You might do it with immigrant women. You might do it with, elderly immigrant women from India, right? That you can take this as specifically as you want to, and do this kind of mapping to try to really understand the people that you are going to be working with, and trying to figure out exactly what it is that they are thinking about, doing, saying, and hearing about you. So we're going to walk through that. So I'm going to click back on this. And if you don't still have it open, I'm going to give you the link to go back into this, because into our little activity area. Oh, and I thank you, Judy. I didn't come up with the empathy map, but it's the trauma-informed empathy map in particular I came across, and I find it really useful because it aligns with our values. We're not just trying to find customers and market to them, right? We're trying to understand them quite deeply. So if you come back into and join me over here again, what we're going to do now is go into what we know about newcomers, building an empathy map. And so what you should see here is the first step. So the first step is understanding. And so a couple of things just to orient you. So what you see here are two clusters, right? On the left-hand side, we see what people see and hear, and on the right-hand side, what they say and do. And if it didn't pop up already, on the top right corner, you can see some instructions. So I've added here some questions for you to think about. So on the left, you want to say, okay, what do newcomers see and hear about settlement services? You can be as specific about your own services or more general. What do they see and hearing from? What do friends and family say? Let's say, for example, what's influencing them? What do they hear about you in the ethnic and community media? And so what you need to do then at the bottom is to start adding little Post-its, right? So if you click on this little plus sign at the bottom and go into see and hear, they hear, you might say like there's lots of competition, and then click save, and it'll post it right here. And now what others can do is you can actually comment on that if you want to. If someone has said something that you would have said, you can comment and add comments, or you can continue to add your own. So what I've done, so there's one on the right-hand side. I pulled something out of a report, for example, from 2018, where the Regional Diversity Roundtable asked newcomers, what do you think about settlement services, informal and formal, for example? Okay, great. So people are starting to add. This is excellent. So this is again, the questions are on the right, and they remind you, so what do newcomers say about your services? What are they saying to other people? What do they do to get information? What decisions do they need to make? What do they need to do differently, for example? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to just play with these. And you can see as people add them, they start to the page starts to scroll up and down. And feel free if it's unclear, if there's any questions, feel free to unmute, raise a hand, or pop into the chat and let me know. But it looks like people are in there and playing with it. So lots of interesting. And if you're working in one and you want to sort of see them all, you can also expand this to the full window, so you can sort of see all the different cards in one space. You can do that you should be able to do that on your own screen as well. And remember, once you're done with the see and hear, what are they saying and doing? And again, the questions are here. So what do they say about your services? What do they say to other people? What can you imagine they might be saying? What do they do to get information? So there's the doing as well. What do they need to do differently to get that information? What decisions do they need to make? They don't, yeah, so this is great. So there's a lot of information. They don't know where to start. Some expect us to do all the legwork to get a job. These are really important. It gives you a really good sense of where people are at, right? So what they say depends on their experience. Yeah, that's a valid point. We're doing a very big generic kind of newcomer focused empathy map, but what you'll do is something more specific. So you absolutely, when you're doing an empathy map with the groups you're trying to reach, you'll do specific ones for each group. So you may have a program where you're very, very specifically trying to target 4 or 5 different groups in the community. And the trick is to go through this process with each of them so that what they say and do is specific to them. In this case, we're just being a bit generic because I want to introduce the idea of going through this exercise with you to sort of think through along these lines, what you're perceiving, what you're hearing, what you know. This is a really interesting one. So people many times wishing for more tangible support beyond resources and assisting in applications. So that starts to speak to the limitations of the services that we offer that aren't necessarily anything other than to do with funding. And things like that. So but it raises a really important question about when you see and hear that, how might you change how you communicate information about your services, right? So when someone has, or was it up here about, someone mentioned something about employment and they want you to do all the legwork. So if you're hearing that, right, we hear from newcomers all the time, oh, I have a negative view of that organization because I didn't get a job, right? And did you guarantee them a job? Did you say 80% of our clients tend to get a job, but not everybody does, right? What do you need to rejig your communications if that's kind of the view that they're having? If you're hearing these things, if you're seeing this in the community, what does that mean for how you need to communicate about your programs? What does that mean for how you need to market and share information about your program so people have a really informed understanding about what they're getting themselves into when they come to you? Yeah, we did. Thank you, Shreya, for answering. The trauma-informed empathy map will be in the slides, and I'll try to find a link for it as well from where I can't remember where I found it exactly, but it'll be in the slides, so you have at least that view and you can replicate that and play with it. So in a lot of cases, what you'll do in person is you'll put something like that up on the wall and you'll stick Post-it notes to it. You could pull that into like a Google Jamboard and do the same thing, or you can do it in sort of the way that we're doing it here. All right, lots of great feedback. So I'm going to move on to the, or am I? Right. Yes. So the next stage, actually, does anyone want to have any more time to add any more thoughts or cards here before we go on to the next step? Because the next step is going to be the fear and hope when it comes to, right? So now we can see what they're seeing and hearing. So let's go through this really quickly, right? So what you might do is if you were in person or if you were using a different board, you might kind of pull these together into themes, right? We're going to start, and we'll do a bit of that as it goes down. The tool will help us to do that, but you'll start to see, oh, we're physically, if you were doing this on a whiteboard or with Post-its, you would pull together, you would start to have that conversation, right? And similarly over here with the say and do. So we're hearing good things. We're hearing people coming back. This is really interesting. Some get attached to one worker and expect that person to provide 100% of supports. When I worked in my initial job, I started at the Kitchener-Waterloo Multicultural Center, and we used to joke, people don't come to the Kitchener-Waterloo Multicultural Center. They come for Pilar, who was our main settlements worker, right? They don't even understand they're coming to the Multicultural Center. Where's Pilar? I need to see Pilar. And that's interesting and really important and tells you a lot about how you need to connect with people, because what's happening in the community, the word of mouth is Pilar will help you, right? She just happens to be in this office. So if Pilar leaves, they're all going to leave with her, right? And that's useful for us to understand about who's a client and what they understand about our services and us as an organization, and how we either embrace that and make sure Pilar stays really happy all the time, or we make sure those clients understand we're more than Pilar, We are other things in the organization. Let us tell you about the other services we have and things like that, and how we reach out to that. That was specifically the Latin American community in Kitchener-Waterloo. So we could reach out to them saying, you've probably heard about Pilar, but we wouldn't use that with the Bosnian community because they might be working with a different worker and see the organization as an organization, not as an attachment to one particular person. And so that's again, it can have an impact. And it sounds trite, right? Like to go out and say, oh, you may have heard of Pilar, but if that's what you're seeing and hearing and what people are saying and doing, then that's going to reach those people in a way that they understand, these people get me. They know what I'm hearing. They know what I want. And then the trick is for us to slide them into, we do more than just Pilar, right? And things like that. So it starts to give you useful, actionable information, right? Yeah, love the space in the community, great service and guidance. So useful information here. So we're going to move on to the next step, which is looking at, and this should change for you automatically. So what do newcomers fear and hope when it comes to settlement inclusion? So what are their biggest fears, frustrations, and anxieties? What stresses them out? What are some of the obstacles between them and what they want to try to reach? But then what are their hopes, right? We don't want to just focus on the downside. We want to focus on what do they really want? What's helping them to cope? What are their ideas of success? What does success look like for them? And what are they ready and prepared to do to move forward? So you want to understand where they're coming at it, recognizing that, yeah, they've got some fears and frustrations, but they also are being very positive in this space as well. So what does that look like? Yeah, I mean, that's always been an issue, but that's more an issue now than ever before, it feels like, and especially as I'm responding to the permanent housing one, especially as we see the numbers are going to increase with immigration. Permanent housing that's affordable, we know is a challenge. Can I find a job in my profession? How long is it going to take? A huge, huge challenge. Yeah, trauma and triggers, right? Yeah. I always go back to the air show when it comes to trauma and triggers in the GTA, because that triggers a lot of people who have come out of refugee and war situations, and we don't even think about it. But you start to see agencies more and more start to communicate with their clients ahead of time. This is going to happen. It's happening on this weekend. You're probably not going to be able to get out of the city to avoid it. So here's ways you can cope when planes fly over your apartments in the middle of the city and it sounds like, and you're triggered and you come back to a memory. That can be really useful, right? That takes into account what you understand of the people that you're working with and serving, and you're supporting them in those situations. So understanding their trauma and their triggers can help you with your communication, can help you with how you provide information to people. There's a lot that's coming out here in the fear and frustrations, which is, again, it'll be different when you're working with specific groups, but you may see a lot of these kind of patterns. And these are patterns that you'll hear directly from people, but also come up a lot in the literature, in the research that's being done in communities. So remember, when we're looking back, we're talking to people in a context, then we may have some knowledge of that context based on research you've done, based on your own experience with these folks, but also based on research that has and is being done that's out there. So their hopes and wants. Yeah, safety, community, integration, acceptance, a counselor to speak in their language. And that's key, right? As we're learning about newcomers and you understand, I can speak English, but I'd be more comfortable if I could speak my mother's language, right? So what does that mean for how you communicate with them? What does that mean for what you message to them? I mean, a lot of organizations have a web page that says we speak 52 languages, right? Why not a web page that has pictures of the people and the languages they speak, right? It makes it much more personal, they recognize, oh, that person, I might see them then when I go to that office. It creates a sense of connection based on something very simple that we do know is a challenge and an opportunity in many cases, right? So when you're learning about these things, programs and services to be free. And that's interesting because there's the flip side of that is some people think free couldn't possibly be good, right? I should have to pay for something, and that's how a lot of people pay immigration consultants and other people for what services you might provide, for example. So if they're free, do you say that they're free? If that's what they want, if that's what they want to understand, do you make sure that people understand that these things are free to be able to function, appreciate educational background and experience? Lots of great stuff here. So I'm going to go quickly because I'm just realizing I'm moving more slowly through all of this than I thought. We only have like another half hour. So let's see how you mapped your newcomer audience. I'm going to go to the next step where it's going to pull in a word cloud of all of the words that you've used in those 4 areas, right? And what you can see, you can click on each word and you can see what people have written, right? So you can see when you click on it that this is a hope and a want because it's green. This one is a fear and frustration because it's red. This one is a say and do. So the different colors will show you. So this will give you a sense of, as a group, what we're seeing the most. So people want to, and again, it's a word, not a phrase cloud. So it's going to have some strange words like find, but what do they want to find? They want to find a job. They find the services useful, find the program. They want to find housing, job, so you start to see some of the patterns and some of the language that's being used here. What information. Oh, did I click on hopeful? Oh, yeah. So they need tailored information. They need to be guided to information from legitimate sources. Absolutely. There's a lot of information out there. So this will help you kind of walk through really quickly a sense of pulling together some of the themes, right? So a tool like this can do it, but you can physically do it together on a whiteboard or on a mural board or a Google Jamboard or something like that. And you start to pull in then what you can do then to figure out what the themes are. Now, the next steps, I'm going to go through these quickly because I apologize. I have a lot of other stuff I want to kind of dive into, and I know people want to get to tactics. So what we would do next is we would have a conversation about, okay, how can you improve? So don't worry about posting right now. I'm just going to walk you through what these steps would look like. So knowing what we know now, right? Knowing what we've just learned, what we've shared together, the themes we've come up with, what can we do what have we learned and how can we improve their experience, right? What tactics might you use? What more do you feel like you need to know? Because sometimes these themes will raise more questions. And so it's that whole data, insight, and go back, right? And that initial slide is, what have I learned that piques my curiosity, but I feel like I don't know enough about? But you can start to figure out what are some solutions that we might come up with. And then what we would do typically is we would vote on those solutions. So right here, what would happen is all of the ideas that you had created or you had added would be here, and then you could vote as a group and you could say, yeah, I want to work on this one. This one's much more interesting to me. And in this case, you would give up a thumbs up or a thumbs down and work through that process together to see what you voted for and where the group you're working with a team or your entire organization, where you all feel you want to spend your energy, because you're not going to be able to spend time in on every single area that you want to, for example. Okay, so I'm just going to pop back out to the presentation. Sorry, I definitely didn't allocate enough time to go through that entire process. So I'm going to burn through the rest of this pretty quickly. But basically tech, we want to understand some of the general trends and how they apply to the work that you're doing, right? So we know word of mouth, friends and family have continued to be a major source of information. These peer and informal networks are important, and they're increasingly again, informal. There were these weak tie networks where they get the information. But we also know, and the research shows, that the outcome, immigrant and employment outcomes or settlement and employment outcomes can change quite dramatically depending on the source of information. So there was a study done years ago that said getting employment information from family and friends means people had lower employment outcomes than if they got it from a settlement organization or a government agency or an employment organization, for example. And that's really interesting and important, is that the word of mouth is even more important to get out about your services if you can show that you can have a greater impact on them. Increasingly, we know that the internet is a key channel, but it's not just social media. It's not just websites. It's increasingly these closed networks, these digital messaging apps, these groups that newcomers themselves are running and things like that. And we know that people are not accessing services in person because they're doing those 2 survival jobs. They're accessing in settlement and employment information in the evening, late at night, on the weekends when they have time, because they're in survival mode, and 9 to 5 hours don't necessarily work. And I know that a lot of people have expanded hours, but this movement into digital can be really useful as well. We know that in language is still a really important factor, is that even for people who are comfortable in English or French, they still want to access information in their own languages, but there's a lack of it, right? And that's something that's really interesting. So what can you do with as agencies who have multiple languages to combat that, right? Interpretation projects are incredibly expensive, but taking and I say this all the time in most of my sessions, but taking your smartphone and having your staff record a message once a week or once every 2 weeks and a video in their language to talk about a particular issue or to be welcoming, and then posting that on your social media or posting that on your website or posting that on YouTube and sharing that across your different channels shows people that you speak those languages and you're sharing information in those languages for them. And once it's shared in that way, it's easy to reshare in other places, right? It's easy for me to take a video and reshare it on WhatsApp or share it in an email newsletter or send it via text message to somebody, for example. Newcomers also trust media. They trust ethnocultural or community media, but there's not a lot of information about settlement that actually goes through those places. So what are the opportunities there of actually partner with them as information sources, because they may be reaching the people you're trying to reach or convince, in particular people who aren't accessing your services. And we know newcomer women don't get as much information as men do, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is cultural, some of it is family realities, some of it is linguistic. So how do you figure out how to reach people who reach women who may not have the primary access to information in a household, for example? And how do you turn social into informational, for example? When I worked again at the Multicultural Center, we used to have knitting circles for women, but they were settlement information and orientation sessions. And we hear that a lot about food as well, right? People will come together and make food if you have a community kitchen, or they'll do something social. But the reality is there's someone there who's having a conversation with them about family life, about children, about settlement, about learning English. And so you turn those opportunities into informational opportunities as well. So one of the things to show you about technology, and I think we've learned a lot over the last few years, but is that newcomers are very digital, but they're also digital in very specific ways. So this goes back to 2014, almost 10 years ago. Even then, immigrants were spending more time on mobile devices than Canadians were. Even though cell phone plans were out of reach or more expensive than countries of origin, which they are today still, they were prioritizing these resources, right? And last year, there was another survey that's now going to be a yearly survey done in conjunction with the CBC, tells us that cell phones are ubiquitous. We know this already, right? But it's useful to have kind of data. But only 7 in 10 newcomers have a data plan for their phone versus 8 in 10 Canadians. And that's interesting and useful information. So you may have someone with a phone, but they can't afford the data. So they're either accessing free Wi-Fi or they need you to text them information instead of sending it via WhatsApp or other digital messaging apps that require some sort of internet connection. It's also interesting to see stats around, for example, how comparative newcomers are using social media. So WhatsApp, this is no surprise, right? They're using it more than 3 times as much as Canadians. We kind of already know that, but it was really interesting to see that Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter are used more by newcomers than Canadians. So that's really interesting to find out. We also know that they barely any of them have a landline anymore, right? So if you're collecting telephone information in your intake and assessment, a good question is this a cell phone? Why? Because again, you can figure out, can I text this person instead of calling them, right? Do they want to be texted instead of called? What are the implications of not having landlines anymore increasingly, or not having TV sets, for example? That's extraneous, but it means if you're planning a big TV campaign, well, the fewer newcomers increasingly are not buying television sets. They're increasing their media through streaming services, for example. It's also interesting to see, again, that the social media has become the main source of news content for newcomers. So not necessarily content about you, but news, where they're getting their information about news from their countries of origin or here. So social media broadly defined, right? Less so on TV, even less so on radio and newspapers. I mean, it's decreased for everybody, but it's interesting to see these kinds of trends. They're also accessing online news websites more than Canadians are. So this is that whole how do you partner with media sources? Because if newcomers are accessing their content through social media, could you insert yourself into their content in some meaningful way so that newcomers see it? If they've got online news websites that newcomers are accessing, right, almost a third, can you get stories written about you? Should you be advertising in those spaces, for example, and not just on social media? So again, it comes back to the conversation about it's not just social media. Think about the way you've done things before. In the past, you may have put an ad in the local ethnocultural newspaper that physically gets delivered. What's the virtual version of that you might be able to sort of think about as you're moving forward? And so then I'm going from broad to narrow. So then one of the other things I like to show people is you can see by country of origin what their media and technology and information habits were before they came. So this is India from January of this year, where we see that, mobile phones are, ubiquitous across the country. Right, more people own a mobile phone, in particular a smartphone, than they own a computer or a tablet device, for example, right? And they're using those devices to access the internet. So 90% of people who access the internet are doing it through their phones, right? 57% through laptops, but you can see year to year that's decreased by 10%. There's an increase in tablets, which is interesting, but both of those are still, the phone and the tablet are still mobile devices, right? So you can find interesting information, and the majority of them are using Android phones, which is also useful, because earlier I forgot to mention here that one of the things this research found is that iPhones, 6 in 10 newcomers are using an iPhone in Canada, but in their country or in some countries of origin, that's not the case. So either that changes when they get here, or that's a broad definition that doesn't necessarily apply to a segment that you're working with, right? So what are the implications of that? The implications are iPhones, you can use iMessage, which is a more secure platform than Android texting, for example, right? So, if you're using iPhone to iPhone, you might be able to do more secure conversations and different groups with people who are using iPhones rather than Androids. If you're thinking about creating an app, you need to understand what mobile devices people are using, for example. And then why are they accessing? What are they doing when they're online? They're finding information, they're being entertained, they're connecting with friends and family, right? They're researching brands, they're researching how to do things. So they're using the internet in ways that have potential impact on what you might share online. Why are they using social media? Again, it's mainly friends and family. They're looking for information, news stories, content, they're being entertained, they're just filling spare time. So are you on this continuum, right? So again, if they're keeping in touch with friends and family, those are those word of mouth connections that you want to make sure you're making, because it's way down here where they're looking at content from brands, right? It's much lower when they're on social media. So they're not necessarily looking to follow you on social media. They might, but you need to confirm that, right? So if you're trying to reach newcomers from India, understanding this information is useful ahead of time, right? So you can start to kind of ask questions. Okay, that's people in India. Now, newcomers who came from India, is that still true? Are they looking at, we're a brand, are they looking for content from us on social media, or are they looking to get it differently? And that will inform your strategy really importantly, right? So the types of accounts that they follow, once again, brands are pretty low on this, right? But they follow influencers, of course, friends and family, and entertainment for the most part, right? And then the most used platforms, again, this is useful because it can change quite dramatically from country to country. So WhatsApp, Instagram, Telegram was probably way down here just a few years ago. So you can see these change from year to year. This comes from a website that you'll get the link to, where you can actually look at country reports over the past years and sort of see some of these trends. And again, some of them are specific, right? I'm assuming Moj and MX Takatak are Indian specific social media platforms, and you'll see in different countries that there are some of those things that actually still factor in more than the big ones. And so where they find information about brands, where they might find information about you, for example, search engines, right? Ads on social media. So people are using ads, but are they looking for you as a brand? Are they using social media in that way? But it's useful to have this kind of big picture information. And they're using, again, social networks, friends, family, and informal networks, and search engines to find information about you. So are you appearing in search results? Are you factoring in the conversations people are having in social networks, right? So the two questions, if you're not already asking them, I recommend to people that they add two questions about their contact information when you're talking to newcomers. What digital devices and tools do they use to communicate, find, and share information? And then you might have a number of options, right? SMS, WhatsApp, Telegram, Facebook Messenger, etc. And then, almost more importantly, how do you, as a newcomer, want to communicate with us? Because they may say, yeah, I use text, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, and I message on Instagram as well, but I prefer that you text me, right? So what happens, right? For those of you who are already collecting this information, hopefully you have this kind of data. But if you imagine you're serving 1,000 clients a month, at the end of 3 months, you have 3,000 points of data that tell you, oh, 80% of our clients are using WhatsApp and 70% of them would like us to communicate with them using WhatsApp. Okay, that tells you something about how you are going to reach out to folks. Now, you'll probably get a number of different options here. But if you ask them for the top 1 or 2 about how they prefer to communicate with you, you will start to get the kind of data and information that can inform the way you communicate with clients, which will have an impact on your outreach as well. Okay, so now we need to create WhatsApp communities or some WhatsApp groups so that we can let people join them and we can broadcast information out through WhatsApp to reach them, which they can then really easily reshare to other groups and things like that. It also helps you make those kind of financial decisions within your organization, because you can say, you know, we either need we all need smartphones with data plans or Wi-Fi in the office so that we can use WhatsApp, or we need a tool like a Twilio, which is a tool that you can program to send broadcast messages out through different digital messaging tools like WhatsApp or Telegram and things like that. But it starts to inform the strategy. It starts to tell you where you need to put some of your focus on tactics and technologies as well as strategy, for example. So I've put again in the link. This stuff comes from a website called Data Reportal. So I grabbed the top 5 countries in Peel region that I saw in the demographics, and each one of these will take you to an in-depth look on each of those countries, which can help at least you create some sense of what are their habits and tools that they're using before they come to Canada. And again, you still need to talk to them to find out what their habits are now, but it can be really quite useful. So China is a great example, right? Most of the social media we use, they don't use, right? The great internet wall of China, they're using WeChat and Sina Weibo and other tools. But when they come to Canada, how does that change? Are they suddenly also on LinkedIn? Are they using Facebook more? You know, things like that. So you want to kind of get a look at some of these details, but you always want to kind of confirm it for your own clients. And for me, the best way is to start adding that to your points of intake so you can collect real data and then have those conversations with newcomers directly to find out what are the tools and tactics and strategies that are going to work best to reach out to them. So we've got about 15 minutes left. So I want to see if there's any questions. So what I'm going to talk about really quickly, though, is objective, strategy, and then tactics. And I apologize I always overprogram, but you'll get all of the slides that will have the different resources. But any quick questions or thoughts that come up before I dive in? Where is Ukraine in these links? Good question. I took data from the most recent census poll from probably a couple of years ago. So Ukraine isn't here, but they're easily added. Each one of these, I'll just click on the link, for example, you'll see it's Data Reportal reports. All you need to do is change the country at the end and you will get the digital report for Ukraine, right? And so it provides an overview, some high-level information, and then down at the bottom is where I pulled out all of those slides. So you'll see a bunch of different information about each country, basically. So they provide global data, and then they provide information directly into the country that you're looking at. So, you know, what's their cell phone connections, and you'll find this in a lot of countries. There are more cell connections than people. But a lot of people have multiple SIMs or multiple devices and things like that. So you can find that information in those Data Reportal reports. But thank you for asking. That is a good question. So the objectives, the communication goals, it's really important that you get specific with these things, right? So a project goal is that we want to, provide employment services to help newcomers. A communication goal is to share information that helps them understand how we can help them find a job. But the action, what action do you want them to take what happens with the information. You want to lead them to something, right? I want you to download this toolkit. I want you to download our resume package. I want you to attend this event. I want you to make an appointment and become a client. Here's our job developer is ready to assess your skills and connect you with an employer. Whatever the case might be, you want to be as specific as possible in your action and your communication goals, so that you're leading people directly to what is an action and not just sort of an awareness, right? Awareness is important, but what is it you can do for them is what kind of matters, right? And you want them to be able to share this with other folks. So objectives around this are, again, who you're trying to reach, what do you know about them, who are they connected to, and what are their goals, right? Going through that empathy mapping will kind of get you to understand their context so that you can tailor the message to them in that context. And that requires a lot of time and thought, right? But it means that you're reaching out to somebody at a moment where they need that particular piece of information, right? And so you want to make sure that the strategy you have is part of a broader content strategy, because you want it to be connected to your overall organizational communications goals, which means having, connected to your website, which means connected to social media, which means connected to, getting that information to people at the right place at the right time. And that requires understanding them fully and understanding the tools that they're going. It also means you don't have to create all of that stuff yourself. So one of the things that we want to make sure is that the information you provide is accurate and appropriate, right? And one of the ways to do that is to go through a little test, right? Is the information I'm providing current? Is it reliable? Is it accurate? Is it authoritative? Am I an authority to speak on this? Is the bias clear, right? Like I'm doing this to help you. I'm not trying to sell you anything. Our information is for free. Our services are free. And you want to find this kind of sweet spot in the middle. There's content you think and that newcomers need. There's content that they tell you they want, right? But we know down here, there's sometimes people don't know what they don't know sometimes. And then the question is, do you need to create that yourself, or can you reuse content that other people have created and then make and share this content and put it out to newcomers? So again, these are the most important: understanding newcomers, what your perception is of them, but also understanding directly what they want from you, and then either create that content or repurpose that content from other sources that may have been doing it. You can work in sharing content with other folks. You can find a YouTube video that addresses the questions that they're asking and reuse that in your context. You don't have to create all of the messaging and all of the content, but you can direct people towards the stuff that is useful for them. And so I talk a lot about, you also want to direct people back to your website. Your website as a home base still matters. So even if you're interacting with them on WhatsApp or on Facebook, or you've got them on a YouTube video, you want to bring them back to your home site. You want to bring them back to where they can get more information, where they can register, where they can access additional resources, where they can contact somebody, where they can access a chat bot or a text chat on your site, whatever it might be. Don't forget about this home base and how important it is when you're out there reaching out. I see a lot of folks on social media posting useful information, but without a corresponding link back, or they'll send out a link to a YouTube video and the description doesn't have a link back to their website. And so the better idea is, don't send me a link to your YouTube video, send me a link to your website where the YouTube video is embedded. And then it's embedded in the context of other information. Because the moment you send someone out to another site like YouTube, you've sent them off. They're gone, right? They're now looking at the next YouTube video. They've forgotten why they even started this search in the first place. And now they're looking at cats playing with dogs. And it just sort of, because that's the nature of those sites. They draw them in and they tell them, oh, you might want to look at this next, for example. So as much as you can, bring them to your sort of home base and have the information there for them. And the best way I find to do this is to work through some scenarios in your organization. So you can think about, as you're looking at that customer journey, right? How is it that they're coming to you? Did they find you through Google? Did someone refer to you? Do they even know about you? Are you the right service for them? And put yourself in their shoes as much as you can, as well as talk to them about how they came to you, for example, right? So let's say someone searched for you via a Google search. They land on your site. They don't know you. They've never accessed your services before, but they're seeing the 15 seconds that you've got to convince them has said, oh yeah, I want to talk to somebody, but I'm not sure about what you offer or how you'll help me. And so I read through a few things on your site. Now, each one of these, will it lead them to the next step? Will it make it clear for them how to get more information? is it easy for them to take the next logical step, right? Or do you have more of a brochure of a website that says, we've been doing this for 25 years and we've successfully helped newcomers integrate? Who are you targeting with the information on the site, right? You want them to take the next obvious step, for example. And sort of creating these kinds of scenarios can be really useful to help you walk through a lot of these different steps to start to find holes in your communication and in your website and in the way you're writing some information. And I won't pull them up, but I went into a few sites now, for example, where from a Twitter account, it linked to a page on someone's home website, but the information that was being referenced is actually further down the page. So I land on that page and I'm met by text that isn't relevant to the link that I just clicked on. And unless I scroll down, I will never see that information. And so you've either lost me right at that moment because I'm like, I don't know what to do now, or I will take the next 10 or 15 seconds to scroll down and find my way. A better thing is to make that link very specific to either a separate page or an anchor on that page. You can, on a website, and this website actually had that. You could anchor so that it would take them down to that part of the page, but the link didn't do that, right? So you want to make sure that you're not making them think when you're sharing information. You're leading them directly to what you told them you were going to lead them to, not something that's kind of too generic or too broad, or doesn't give them the obvious next step in what they need to do. So strategy. Just going to go through this quick because we don't have a lot of time. It comes back to this question of looking at understanding who your audience is, what your goals are, and what you're offering them, and then positioning your organization as, are you a problem solver for all newcomers, or are you serving specific communities? Who is it you're trying to reach with your targeted communication? And what does success look like? Now, success is defined by the goals you had when you were communicating, right? So it might be to raise awareness. It might be to get someone to register. It might be to connect them to employment or to take a different action. But what it means is that what I'm trying to measure isn't how many times someone clicked on something or how much someone engaged with something. I'm sharing something for someone to take a particular action. So if I'm sharing something that says you might be interested in our upcoming webinar on, finding employment for accountants, for example. It takes them through, and you want them to register on that page. So you need to target the folks and the networks and the people who are working with internationally trained accountants to share that message. You might share it on Twitter, but you might direct it more specifically to the people who are actually working with those folks, or who you know of, who you've identified in your own research are active in those communities, and then link them through to that specific action, right? And so the success is that action led to an increase in registrations, and that's how you define your success. It's based on the communications goals, right? What will you use? How will you use what you learn in order to take next steps, right? So again, it's understanding that if this didn't work, right? Again, going back to this constant sort of test and iteration, what we didn't work. So how will we use that to improve our communications in the future? How will I go through with an eye as a client to say, did this lead me to what I need to know, understand, sign up for? Did it take me through to the action that I want them to take? Is it clear what I'm asking them to do, and that they can do it based on what I'm sharing with them? So if we had the time, I apologize, I went through this really quickly. We would go through what are the tactics that you're using, right? What are the in-person approaches you're using? What are you finding success with? And what I'm going to be doing is sharing. Oops, sorry about that. Is sharing. So there's tactics that are in person or sort of traditional outreach tactics, and then there's technology augmented tactics. And what you're looking at here is a ton of different approaches, and you need to sort of work through what that could look like. So on this form, and they'll be shared in the documentation, there was a workshop done a number of years ago that outlines a number of different approaches about what you can do. These are the in-person kinds of tactics, right? The building relationships, doing art, media, and advertisement. And then what I want to talk about is how you translate that to online, right? And the biggest thing for us is to understand that you don't necessarily have to be the one doing the sharing or the outreach, but you need to be connected to the people that are, right? So similar to, again, those in-person connections or influencers or community gatekeepers, figuring out what those are virtually. So we've seen that on the left-hand side, this is more than 20 years of online bulletin boards where newcomers have congregated and are sharing information with each other about settlement. And most of us don't have a presence in those spaces. Now, increasingly, newcomers are creating their own networks where you can, or media outlets where they're sharing information by newcomers for other newcomers. So what do we know about those spaces and how do we insert ourselves into them? And then the final is the more difficult, which is increasingly those spaces are becoming private, right? These WhatsApp groups, these Messenger groups, these Facebook groups, these Telegram groups. And so what you need to do is find out who's running those groups and how you can reach out to them to help share your information. A lot of times that information will come from your clients, right? So you can have conversations about what, are you part of WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups or, where you were able to find useful information? Would you be willing to share information about our services into those spaces? Can you connect me with the person who runs that group? And maybe we can share information with them and they'll share it with the group, because most times they're not going to let you join those groups because they're a community group. They're not a service or an employment group necessarily, but they might be willing to share your information. And another example is increasingly newcomer vloggers, right? So I like to point out that, newcomers are vlogging, or, they're sharing video of their story of arriving in Canada. So this is one woman from India, and her screen name is Peekapoo. But when she shared 3 years ago, she shared her first day in Toronto, 1 million views, right? What she spends for groceries a day ago, 36,000 views in a day, right? Information about her daily life, hundreds of thousands of views. You will probably never get this kind of viral outreach messaging. But what if she talked about your services, right? If you go into the about sections of go into YouTube today after this and type in first days in Peel or first days in Canada, and you'll see the number of different people who are newcomers who are talking about and sharing their stories. And in many cases in their about section on their YouTube channel, they have their email address and they're willing to connect to see how you could work with them, because this is part of their work now. Influencers, they're content creators. We hear about these people. They exist in our sector as well. And if she spoke about the services you have to offer or gave an overview of, these are newcomer services you can access in Peel and why they're useful, you'll reach a much larger audience of people who may never have heard of you before, but who are following her. And that includes potential pre-arrival as well as post-arrival folks as well. So these are some of the new influencers that I'm talking about. It's these vloggers, these WhatsApp group administrators. It's different, content creators on Instagram accounts and places like that. And we need to be forging relationships with them as well in order to make sure that we're reaching out to the groups that they're connected to. And it means honing your messaging, but not necessarily having to chase after those groups because they already serve them and provide information for them. So you have to make choices. So the last thing, and I'm, I apologize, we're over time, is to show you that in the slides, what you'll see is some resources to help you go through and make some strategic choices. So what you want to do is you want to hit this area here where you have choices that are high impact but low cost, right? And to do that, you want to sort of think about every tactic as if it's a funding application, right? What is it that, so I want to create a Twitter account to reach, or I want to create an Instagram account to reach newcomer youth, and I want to spend this much money on ads. Okay, so who's going to do it? What outcomes are you defining? Who's going to benefit from this? How does this address your service priorities? What resources do you need? How are you going to measure success? And what other restrictions or, what do you need to understand about your clients in order to understand whether this was successful? So I've created a little canvas to help you kind of do that. And it walks you, this will link you through to the page, but it walks you through understanding. I want to reach this group, but this is the first group I want to reach. So I want to use Instagram to reach newcomers. I'm going to start with youth. What's the issue? Why is this the solution? Or what's the issue you're trying to address? Newcomer youth don't have information. How is it being addressed today? We're trying to send them email. They never reply to email. So the solution is I've talked to my newcomer youth. They're using Instagram. They would follow us if we were on Instagram. So we want to do an Instagram account. How will you measure success? They'll actually follow us and they'll actually act on the information we provide, how does it benefit them? Well, they're going to get information they need, and it's going to be timely, and it's going to be in a format that makes sense to them. Why you? Why are you the person who should do this? Because I work with youth, and I'm the one who they are connected with. They trust me. I have rapport with. How are we going to outreach it? I'm going to tell all my clients. They're going to tell all their friends. We're going to measure success in these different ways, not just stats, not just followers, but we'll go back to the youth and ask them, was this useful? Did it help give you information you needed? Did it get you through to do that? So what resources do you need? Well, I need time, because the account itself is free. And then I need, $10 a month to do some targeted Instagram ads. And I need a phone, or, I think Instagram now you can do via your computer, increasingly through different other places. So what do you need to do that? Are there any security concerns or privacy or confidentiality? Well, people do message through Instagram, and it's not secure. So I know if I get messages from youth, I need to move them to a phone conversation or WhatsApp, which is secure, or another medium where we can interact with each other. So you sort of think through in a really quick way, a pitch that you can make to your team, to your bosses, to understand what is it that will help you to choose your tactics, and being strategic about how you choose those tactics. Because it's easy. It's easy for me to create an Instagram account, but there's a lot underlying it that from a work perspective, or from a success perspective, or from an organizational perspective, there are more questions that you need to be able to answer in order to show that this is the right tactic for the right audience, that you understand them, and that you're going to keep measuring it and figuring out if it's having the impact that you want to have. And then talking about messaging, the biggest thing you need to understand when you're messaging people is, why should they care? What's in it for them? And who are you to tell them that, right? So when we talk about newcomer information practices, trusted sources, and that's why, again, working with influencers can be really useful, because if they don't know you, if they've never heard of your services, coming from Peekapoo might be much more impactful than coming from you on YouTube, where they may never find you. You may never have use the right keywords that they're using, versus a content creator who is deeply embedded in that community. And they want to know, what's in it for me? What the action you're asking me to take? How will it benefit me? Why should I be listening to you over above all the noise on social media, or all the posters I see on the wall in front of me? What is it that you'll do for me that is different than what someone else can do? So I'm going to end there, just to say that we kind of covered a lot of this stuff. All of the materials are here in the slides that you'll get after. And you're going to get those outreach worksheets from the Toronto South Lip. You'll get these slides, and I'll send a summary of the activities we did on that online tool as well. So I apologize for overpacking the session, but I'm also available. You'll have all this information in the slides to be followed up with if you have any questions or concerns out of this session, or any follow-up you want to do to continue this conversation after. So I apologize for going over and for the overshare, but thank you so much for participating. And I hope that you found something useful here that you can use in your work.
Oh, thank you so much, Marco. It was a gold mine of information. I think we're seeing that in the chat box. Everyone's so grateful. And you've been so generous, and thank you for sharing your contact information, as some people might have some questions as they move along. And I hope this helped inspire you to move to some planning and action in this area. Shreya has shared the evaluation survey, so we'd love to hear how you're planning to take some of this information away. And we're looking forward to seeing folks who want to join our follow-ups, our next session in April on resettlement support for privately sponsored refugees. That's coming up. So thanks again, Marco, and thanks to everyone for joining. What a wonderful way to spend the morning together.